3, 2, 1.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective. And we've got a topic today that is appropriate. It happens to be Bob Dylan's birthday, which, is wonderful news. He is not getting any younger, but it's good to see him still kicking. He is a very famous and successful musician, probably most known for his work in the 1960s. He's a symbol of his time. And we're going to talk about not only Bob Dylan, but the era, the 60s, and kind of how to look at it. You know, Bill Clinton once said something like, if you see the 1960s as a mostly good time, then you're probably a liberal. If you see the 1960s as a predominantly bad period, you're probably conservative. I think Clinton said that in the 90s. Anyway.
Someone else said, if you remember the 60s, you were not there.
Because
the idea was, if you were there, you were too stoned.
That's a pretty good saying that people have said as well. So we obviously don't remember the 60s. Don't let Nikos's beard fool you. He hasn't been alive for that long. But we're going to talk about kind of how we think about it as people who are living today with a lot of the consequences of the 60s. We enjoy some of the good stuff that arguably came from the 60s. And also, as students of objectivism, which is what we are here on this show, we're going to try to kind of understand what is the objective assessment of that period. So here to help me is a guy who was already interrupted once, Nikos Sotirakopoulos.
Thank you very much, Rucka. So, Bob Dylan, his birthday was 2 days ago. He's 80 years old. He's lived this life, and here's the interesting thing with Bob Dylan. He's not the best singer in terms of his voice. He's not the most unbelievable guitarist ever. He hasn't written the best country music. He hasn't written the best blues. And yet, he's, as you said, the thing that makes him very special is that he's the symbol of that era. So the first thing that I find very, very interesting, first of all, let's define what era we're talking about. We're in the early 60s, where the gateway, let's say, to the hippies is the beat generation. So we're talking about people like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac. And the first thing that I find very fascinating is that in our mind, the 1960s was an era of questioning of American values, questioning of these core American values. So we're in a time where actually there are many reasons to be indignant. Racial injustices, treatment of LGBT people, all that stuff. Someone had good reasons to be indignant. And then came the Vietnam War. So there was more and more stuff to feel that there's some injustice here. But at the same time, this reaction to these American values had something very American in it. Now, the most obvious example is, think about Easy Riders. Think about Steppenwolf's songs, Born to be Wild. You ride a bike and there's just a highway in front of you. And if you read Jack Kerouac On the Road, there's something very, very American in it. So we have this idea of individualism, and we put a question mark for now. Is this true individualism, not true individualism, half individualism? But this idea that a society that tells me you have to be this way, like the austere father with the suit who says, you young man, you have to do this and this, and young man revolts on it in a very American way by riding the motorcycle and going to wherever the horizon is going to take you. So this is the first interesting thing that I find in Bob Dylan. And even in his music is this blurring of blues and country music, and that's what makes it quite beautiful. So that's the first thing I want to throw to the table. Is this in a way anti-American Americanism? Because at the same time, the beatniks are consciously anti-American, or consciously of what America at that time was. So for example, I think I mentioned it in the past, go and check Allen Ginsberg poem America, which is basically, what's the opposite of an anthem? It's basically an attack, a conscious attack to America and the decline that he sees in America or the rotten essence of America. So we have an un-Americanism, which has something very American to it.
Yeah, it's difficult to separate the good from the bad. You know, the sort of like canned, like objectivist response would be like to hell with the 60s, or certainly that element you spoke about, this whole rebelliousness, like born to be wild. What are you, a wild animal? I mean, understandable that somebody would say that. Certainly somebody who was alive 50, 60 years, around the turn of the century could basically look at what was happening culturally and say, this is nothing but nihilism. They might say, this is just disintegration. However, we know from growing up in decades much later than that, the way you respond to art around you, the way you respond to certain influences can definitely range in why you responded the way you did. Did you respond because you like seeing destruction, or did it sort of empower you in a way, make you feel like a certain type of individualism? Of course, it's misguided individualism, and it kind of left unsupervised, like left without a good philosophy. A lot of these rock and rollers end up on all types of drugs, committing all types of terrible acts and hurting themselves, and which is why, they don't trust anyone over 30, right? who could survive that long with that type of attitude. So, I think the word of the day is abstract. Try to abstract from that whole scene what was good about it, or what can be abstracted positively from it and used towards a good end.
And also in a way, it's very interesting that today, part of this 96 counterculture, if you'd show this to a millennial, let's take the SJW caricature, not the caricature. Let's say you go to a young liberal student in the university and you show them, for example, Easy Rider. They will say, this is basically right-wing conservatism, individualism. You don't care about that stuff. You ride your motorcycle. Or again, remember the lyrics of Born to Be Wild. Like it's almost it's today they say that's very anti-environmental and all that stuff. So again, it's the time where this, what you mentioned as nihilism, is not yet nihilism, or if it is nihilism, it's nihilism that has as basically basis whatever is good in our tradition. Mm-hmm. Which is, again, this individualism. Yeah. And there's a brilliant scene in Mad Men. I think it's in season 1. And I'm going to put on the comments the exact episode because I don't remember from the top of my head, but I remember it now. There's Don Draper, who is visiting one of his mistresses. So Don Draper is the guy who works in the advertising industry. And his mistress has some of beatniks there. And they have a very interesting discussion. So the beatniks are half stoned, and Don Draper is basically looking at them with disdain. And they tell him something like, "You create a lie. You are a creator of lies." And Don tells them, "Make something of yourself." And they say, "What? Make something? Do you want me to be something like you?" So basically, for the beatnik, this idea of the urban suit-wearing producer is what you don't want to be. And then the discussion goes on. The beatnik says, "You create the lie. You read the New York Times or the whatever was." And Don says, "I'm not a servant of the system. There's not even a system. Get over yourself." And then there's the most brilliant moment. There are some sirens, some police sirens from outside. So the beatnik, like half stone, says, "Where do you go? You can't go out there." And Don says, "You can't go out there." And I think there's something very metaphorical in this, that the confident bourgeois, let's say, figure of Don Draper sees the world out there and says, "I can go out there. This is a safe world. I can make sense of the world." But the beatnik has this existential scare that the world out there makes no sense. And think about many lyrics from the 1960s songs. They have exactly this message. Remember the song that says, "Don't go out tonight." So again, it's the idea that something bad is going to happen. Or the song that says, "We're in the eve of destruction." So many of these songs, you see this existential uncertainty. So on the one hand, Bob Dylan and all this counterculture is telling you, take life in your own hands, which is nice and inspiring. And by the way, good music. For example, I love the Doors. There's some good music at these years. But at the same time, the whole culture and the whole ethos around that time is telling you, take life in your own hands, but life doesn't make sense at the same time. So that's why you have this generation being somewhere in between, somewhere wanting to ride the bike and, you know, live your life, but at the same time, retreating to retreating to things that gave them existential security. So what comes after the 60s? We have the New Age, mysticism, spirituality, all that stuff. And the idea is we need to find this refuge from this world out there that doesn't make sense. So we start trying to change the world. And when we don't change the world, or when we mess up because we haven't got a plan, now we retreat to this New Age spirituality. And even Bob Dylan went through that phase. He went through a religious phase after the 60s. And I think it's not a coincidence.
I think Bob Dylan mentions Ayn Rand in one of his lyrics, in one of his songs. I think he says something, someone in the chat room could probably post the exact lyrics. He says something like, I've been Ayn Randed, and like he's talking about the range of stages he's gone through. I've been this, I've been Ayn Randed, I've been called communist because I'm left-handed, something like that. Something along those lines. So I think in the age-old false dichotomy between intrinsicism and subjectivism, there has always been a better option missing. So we see this in the 1960s. You've got like traditional way of life and complacence and take the life handed to you as sort of intrinsicism. You know, there's intrinsic value in traditions and institutions, and, you know, and be responsible. So personal responsibility in that package deal goes along with complacence and doing what you're told and not being too into sex, not, you know, being too eager to try it before you're married, stuff like that. And then the response to it was in large part basically subjectivism, kind of like my individualism, kind of my first-handedness comes in the form of deciding what's true, and whatever I want, you know, regardless of context, is what I'm going to do. So they're both wrong. So I could imagine somebody going through the 1960s just shaking their head at the whole thing and saying there's nothing good coming of this. And they're not wrong, because for something good to come of this, we need some philosophical guidance. We need we need some clarity. So it'd be great. And luckily, Ayn Rand was there, developing her philosophy as this was all unfolding. That intrinsicism versus subjectivism is a false dichotomy. It's actually, there's a trichotomy. There's objectivism, which sort of helps you sort through all of these things and shows you, yes, independence is paramount, but there is an objective reality you need to abide by. There is personal responsibility, but you don't accept it out of intrinsic duty. You do it for the sake of living a good life. And this is the power of philosophy. Thank you, Christopher, for the Canadian super chat.
Thank you, Christopher. And I've posted in the chat the link with the scene of Don Draper, which again I think it's a scene that captures the spirit of the era in a perfect way. So here's two interesting questions that I have. The first one, what happened to that generation eventually when they grew up? And the second question is, what was the reply of conservatism to this? Because the counterculture was very, very powerful. I think there's no question that the counterculture changed American society in a very profound way. And when it comes to art, for example, the example I would think is Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry movies. So this was this almost clumsy attempt to say, no, we are still here, that you've created a society of permissiveness, of everyone does whatever we want, but the conservative America is still here. But also, some of that ethos of the counterculture went also in the religious right. So I think I mentioned in the past, most people think that the new Christian right was mostly people who freaked out with the 60s and they went to the right. Part of this is true, but part of the new right were people who used actually the message of the 60s to find themselves through religion. So the idea was, yeah, the world out there makes no sense. We live in a world which is crazy, but the solution is not in, let's say, Indian tantras or Eastern spirituality or whatever was in fashion in the hippie communes. The solution is Jesus. That's why you would find in these days the slogan, I'm high in Jesus. So that's one thing, which is to like what was like, did even the conservative America ever manage to put a wall, let's say, to the counterculture? And people are going to say, yes, Reagan and the political victories of the right after the 60s with Nixon and Reagan. The question is, though, culturally, did they ever have to offer something different? Let's go to a super chat before I...
And a quick correction. Robert in the chat says that was not Dylan. It's I've Been Ayn It is by Paul Simon, who, by the way, I like better. I hate to dog on Dylan on his birthday, but Simon and Garfunkel, in my opinion, are two of the greats. And I'm not particularly a fan of Bob Dylan. Go ahead.
What's your favorite music group from these days?
Oh, today?
No, from, let's say, 60s, 70s.
Oh, from the 60s? I think Simon and Garfunkel are probably it. And this is silly, but I really like the Monkees. Hey, we're the Monkees. That's maybe 70s more than 60s. I think the Beatles are definitely... I love the Beatles. I am not a Rolling Stones fan. And, there's that. Super chat time.
Chat time. So Bonnie says, actually, you read it. You're the super chat reader.
I speak English as a first language. Existential uncertainty. Good observation. They didn't have the intellectual weapons. Need a better word than weapons. Yeah, the intellectual technology, the intellectual tools is maybe one way to put it. Oh, you're muted. Way to get censored. You're muted. What were you saying?
Yeah. So, and actually the term existential is, I find it quite often better to use when I speak to non-objectivists rather than metaphysical, because at least in Greece and in part of Europe, when you say metaphysical, it means something which is, let's say, ghosts are metaphysical. So existential uncertainty in, let's say, translated in the objective terminology would be metaphysical uncertainty. Like, I don't know what's the nature of the universe, and this makes this make me incapable of operating, let's say, in this universe. Okay, so the other question was, what happened to this generation and how did they grow up? For me, the ridiculous outcome of this generation is 99 and the NATO bombings of Kosovo. Why I mention this? Who were at the forefront? Bill Clinton, a boy of the 60s. In Germany, Joschka Fischer, who was one of the most prominent activists of the 60s. And in 99, you find him in the SPD government, eager to bomb Serbia. In the UK, Tony Blair, not really a 60s radical, but part of that generation. And in the meanwhile, Bob Dylan has acquired something like 17 houses, and he has a property that extends to something like hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, this is not us saying, oh, this generation, you see, you didn't follow your principles, because their principles were not good anyway. But there was this pragmatism in a way. There were not principles really there. So when you would say to Schroeder or to Clinton, you grew up by going to anti-war protests, and now you're leading a war, the bombings of Serbia by NATO, which is very, very, very questionable, to put it very, very lightly. And they were like, yeah, but there are ideals and then there's reality. So they wouldn't say, oh, we betrayed our ideals. They'd say, well, you cannot, we were singing about this in our youth, but now life got in the way. So I think there's a very interesting lesson from the downturn, let's say, of the 60s generation. And again, the message is not, you cannot have ideals. The message is, these people did not have ideals to begin with. That's why it looks like today they, quote, betrayed their ideals. And And again, 99 was the thing that got me politicized. So it was a very special moment to see, because what you'd usually see in the newspapers is you'd see pictures of these people in the 60s carrying placards for peace, and then being at the head of these governments that were launching this offensive war against, or definitely non-defensive war and humanitarian intervention against Serbia.
Yes, people are complex. Cultures are a collection of complex people, and cultural trends and what goes into political decisions in a late stage mixed economy are complex. I would have liked if Bill Clinton and his Republican Congress had shown some serious teeth at Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda after their 1993 attempt to bring down the World Trade Center. So I would have loved to see them forget about all that give peace a chance stuff in that case. But as you would expect, the blending of pragmatism, altruism, not wanting to be too certain or self-assertive leads America into all types of topsy-turvy and pointless conflicts overseas. So when I think of kind of what came of the hippies, I think of the 1980s, what the sort of group of adults that were dubbed yuppies. So like the hippies became yuppies. These are maybe some of the original objectivists. They're not hippies ever, obviously, if they're, serious about objectivism. But, this is when the sort of students of Ironrand were walking around maybe at the prime of their physical health, they're learning about gym memberships and jogging outfits, and Leonard Peikoff grows a mullet, but they're paying their bills. So like kind of learning, really enjoying the prosperity of the 80s is what a lot of people were doing. And so obviously I'm invoking objectivists, but it's sort of it's confusing. Point is, a lot of hippies, they sort of grew up. Some of them have kids. Some of them pursued a career at one point or another. They graduated college and they went about marketing ideas. They went about production, manufacturing projects, and they became the man. They became he who is older than 30, who you cannot trust. And life turns out is pretty good under capitalism. Going out to lunch is a thing. It's a very 80s thing. You go to work. Let's go out. Where do you guys want to get lunch? What do you guys want to have for lunch? Let's go out for lunch. It's a very 80s thing. The stock market, if Jonathan Honig was here, he would be talking about what the 80s were like, using terms that I can't even follow. So that's what I think of, kind of like what came of the hippies. A lot of them sort of grew up, and probably some of them sort of found religion in a way that Reagan and the moral majority were offering it. But I think the real answer to what came of the hippies is the intellectual force behind that whole hippie revolution, which was, maybe the postmodern philosophy or whatever it was that was happening that brought about this sort of rejection of objectivity and this embrace of hedonistic activity. The sort of intellectual establishment only got stronger. They only multiplied. They only went out and got jobs in the media, got more jobs in academia, jobs in politics, informing voters, organizing voters to elect like-minded politicians, and of course artists, not just modern splotches of paint on the canvas, but movie makers, people who made influential movies, who wrote influential fiction, musicians, of course. They in very subtle ways or explicit ways, they spread a lot of the sort of non-objectivity of the hippie generation into art, and therefore into the culture, in ways that it's going to take a long time to reverse.
But also to be 100% fair here. So after the 60s, the American society in many ways was better than before, in particular ways, in terms of, again, justice towards minorities and all that stuff. Now, the question is, did this happen because of the counterculture, or is it happen that would happen anyway? Or if you read Steve Jobs' biography by, what's the name of Isaacson, I think, the famous biography. So it comes back again and again how this curious, let's say, and unconventional spirit of the 60s helped him in his productive work. So again, this is the discussion is a bit more complicated, as you very correctly say, that just saying, oh, they were all mystics and there's nothing to see there. To begin with, there's some cool music to see there. Anyway, if you want to see more of the 60s, quick pitch. my first book, The Rise of Lifestyle Activism. There's a whole chapter on the counterculture. It's a bit expensive. It's not me, it's the publisher, because it's an academic book. Now, if you want to find out what's me and Rucka's favorite Bob Dylan song, or my experience in a Bob Dylan concert while being in the Greek army, join us in Clubhouse. And here's a whole list of other things happening today. So we have 7 p.m. So basically in 33 minutes, Don Watkins and James Valiant discuss Rand's essay, Our Cultural Value Deprivation. 9 p.m., myself, Maria, but also today joined by Rucka. The topic is flirting with reason and how to deal with rejection in your romantic life. Tomorrow, we have the launching of the communication bootcamp with Don Watkins, only for members. Only for members. So there's still time to be a member. I mean, seriously, even if you become a member only for the communication bootcamp, I think it's worth it. Communication, I think, is a superpower. It's one of the things that can make a big difference in your life. I know it has made in my life. And you're going to be taught by one of the people who is one of the best. So let me tell you something I do. I have a Word document in my computer, which is called Don's Tips. And I go to talks, newsletters, or interactions with Don Watkins, and I just write down knowledge. So this guy knows his stuff. So we begin tomorrow, open for members. So ironrandcenter.co.uk/membership. If not only for that, you support the Ironrand Center UK. So it's a good endeavor anyway. Rucka, any parting words?
We only scratched the surface of kind of what good came of the 60s. So when it comes to rejecting the life that was handed to you and saying, I'm going to do this my way or not at all, definitely the 60s brought about a culture of being able and having the examples around you of people doing that. And obviously it's been taken to excess in some cases, which is why having a rational philosophy and context is paramount. But a lot of actual individualism, I think, was emboldened. Certainly when it comes to sex, for every instance of promiscuity that we can name about coming out of the 60s, there is certainly a rational valuing of sex that has permeated into the culture, thanks to the breaking of the chains that was there earlier. So there's a lot of good about the 60s that maybe I didn't touch upon. Thank you to Rozzy Ginsburg for the 1999 pounds in the super chat. He says, you are amazing with the dancing creature.
Wait, is that really Rozzy?
According to the username, yes. Wherever he is, he's not behind the scenes today. Wherever he is, I'm guessing it's happy hour, and he is just making it rain, throwing money around. So thanks, okay, boss. Anyway, we'll be over on Clubhouse in just a moment. See you guys there. And remember, be back here in 30 minutes for the Don Watkins and James Valiant review of our cultural value deprivation. And of course, coming up at 9 p.m. UK time, Flirting with Reason. I'm going to be the guest. We're going to talk about things that are very concrete, not statistics, not what is society, none of that. Sorry for the accent. See you guys. A lot happening today. So please become a member and support it, for Christ's sake. See you soon. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.